Something happened to you, probably when you were 17 or 23 or 31. You said the wrong thing at a party. You mispronounced a word in front of people whose opinion mattered to you. You waved back at someone who wasn't waving at you. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. Nobody recorded it. Most people in the room have long since forgotten it, or never registered it at all. And yet here you are, years later, at 3 in the morning. And that memory has arrived in your chest like something physical. The exact texture of it. The pause before you realized your mistake. The heat in your face. The way time seemed to dilate around that moment. All of it intact. Crisper, somehow, than things that actually mattered. Crisper than last Thursday. This is not a glitch. It is not anxiety exactly. Though anxiety can amplify it. It is something far older and more architectural than that. What your brain is doing in those dark hours is not malfunctioning. It is doing precisely what it was built to do, with a precision that should disturb you. Because once you understand the mechanism, the randomness disappears entirely. Let's start with what your brain actually is at 3 in the morning. Why? The prefrontal cortex. The part responsible for rational evaluation, for context, for the quiet voice that says this doesn't matter anymore. Runs on glucose and rest. By the middle of the night, especially if you've been sleeping poorly or running a sleep debt, that region is operating at reduced capacity. The regulatory machinery is down. What remains active, what actually increases in activity during rest and light sleep, is a network neuroscientists call the default mode network. The default mode network was for a long time considered background noise, the brain's idle state. That interpretation was wrong. Marcus Reichel at Washington University in St. Louis began mapping it seriously in the early 2000s. And what he found was that when the brain appears to be doing nothing, it is actually running one of its most demanding operations. Processing the self. The DM is where autobiographical memory lives. It's where you simulate other people's perspectives. It's where you construct and maintain your social identity. The story you tell about who you are and how you stand in relation to others. This is the first piece. When you're not actively doing something, the brain turns inward. And what it turns inward toward, with great reliability, is social information. Specifically, social information that feels unresolved. There's a concept in psychology called the Zygarnik effect, named after Bluma Zygarnik, a Soviet psychologist who in the 1920s observed that waiters remembered incomplete orders far better than completed ones. The brain treats unfinished psychological business the same way. An embarrassing moment that you never fully processed, never explained, never repaired, never received external confirmation that it was forgotten, remains flagged. Open, tight. The file never closed. Now add sleep. Sleep is not a passive state. During REM sleep, the hippocampus, which handles the initial encoding of new memories, communicates intensively with the amygdala, the brain's threat detection and emotional tagging system. This process is called memory consolidation, and it doesn't treat all memories equally. Memories that carry emotional weight, particularly negative emotional weight, are preferentially consolidated. They are reviewed, re-encoded, and transferred to long-term storage with a kind of editorial emphasis. The emotional tag gets stronger, not weaker. Matthew Walker's work at UC Berkeley on sleep and emotional memory shows that REM sleep essentially replays emotionally significant events, and that the emotional charge is preserved, sometimes intensified, across that replay. What this means is that every time you've slept after a moment of social failure, your brain has been quietly making sure you don't forget it, not out of cruelty, out of an evolutionary logic that we'll get to. The amygdala's role here is critical and somewhat uncomfortable to contemplate. It doesn't distinguish between a physical threat and a social one with the precision we prefer. Naomi Eisenberger at UCLA ran a now famous experiment in 2003 called Cyberball in which participants were excluded from a simple virtual ball-tossing game by what they believed were other participants, but were actually a computer program. The exclusion was meaningless. The exclusion was with people they'd never met and would never meet. And yet neuroimaging showed activation in the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, the same region that processes physical pain. Social pain is real pain. The system that processes the threat of ostracism evolved long before the neocortex got sophisticated enough to contextualize it. For most of human evolutionary history, being cast out from the group wasn't embarrassing. It was lethal. The brain that treated social failure as a survival threat was the brain that stayed vigilant, stayed corrective, stayed alive long enough to reproduce. We inherited that brain. We are walking around with ancient threat detection hardware running on modern social circumstances, and the mismatch is everywhere. But embarrassment specifically, why does it have this particular staying power compared to, say, grief or anger, which can fade and soften? The answer lies in something June Price Tangney, a psychologist who spent decades distinguishing shame from guilt, identified as the peculiar nature of shame's relationship with the self. Guilt says, I did something bad. Shame says, I'm something bad. And embarrassment is shame's more socially exposed cousin. It's the moment your private self was accidentally made public in a way that felt wrong, uncontrolled, involuntary. Embarrassment carries a specific cognitive signature. It involves what Thomas Gilovich and colleagues at Cornell identified in 2000 as the spotlight effect. We consistently overestimate how much other people notice and remember our mistakes. In their experiments, participants who wore embarrassing t-shirts into a room believed roughly half the people had noticed. The actual figure was around a quarter. We experience ourselves as more visible than we are. But here's the strange part. Knowing this doesn't dissolve the feeling. The rational correction doesn't reach the amygdala in time. The memory was already tagged. And then there's the self-referential processing effect, documented by Timothy Rogers and colleagues in the 1970s, which showed that information processed in relation to the self is encoded more deeply and recalled more accurately than information processed in any other way. Your brain is not a neutral archive. It has a filter called me, and everything that passes through that filter gets a priority tag. An embarrassing memory isn't just any memory. It's a memory about you. It goes into the deepest filing cabinet, and it stays. Now consider what 3 a.m. actually is. You are alone. There is no social input to process, no task to focus attention, no sensory stream to compete with internal signals. The prefrontal cortex is operating at reduced capacity. The default mode network is running. The amygdala is functioning with reduced oversight from higher regulatory regions. And the memory that arrives, that specific 4-second moment from years ago, has been consolidated across hundreds of sleep cycles into something remarkably stable, remarkably vivid, remarkably accessible. It's worth noting that this process is not democratic. Not every embarrassing moment gets this treatment. The ones that survive, the ones that surface at 3 a.m. with that particular quality of freshness, share something. They are the ones that touched a belief you hold about yourself, not incidentally, but directly. The moment you stumbled over your words wasn't just a speech error. It confirmed a fear that you are not as capable as you appear. The wave at the wrong person wasn't just a mistake. It briefly exposed you as someone who misreads social situations. The brain consolidated that memory, not because the moment was objectively significant, but because it was existentially relevant to the narrative you've been constructing about yourself since adolescence. This connects to what Endel Tulving, the neuropsychologist who spent his career studying autobiographical memory, called mental time travel. The uniquely human capacity to project ourselves backward and forward through time. We don't just recall events, we re-experience them, inhabiting them from the inside. And because the self is continuous, because the you who is lying awake is in some fundamental way the same you who stood in that kitchen in 2011. The memory doesn't feel past. It feels like a live report. What does this look like in ordinary life, outside the bedroom ceiling at 3 a.m.? It shows up in the strange way people avoid certain situations they once navigated fine. The presenter who gave one poor talk years ago and has quietly declined similar invitations ever since. The person who made one poorly timed joke in a meeting and now speaks only when certain. These aren't failures of confidence in the present. They are live signals from a memory system that is doing exactly what it was designed to do: prevent a repeat of behavior that once resulted in social pain. The problem is that the system doesn't calibrate for context. It doesn't know that your colleagues from that meeting have all moved on. It doesn't know that the social environment has changed, that you have changed, that the stakes were never what they felt like. The amygdala doesn't receive updates. It receives confirmations or non-confirmations. An absence of evidence is not evidence enough to close the file. In relationships, this creates a specific kind of friction that is difficult to trace back to its source. People carry what psychologists call schemas, generalized patterns built from emotionally significant past experiences, and these schemas operate largely below conscious awareness. Someone who was once publicly humiliated for expressing a strong opinion may become, over years, a person who softens every assertion, hedges every claim, volunteers disclaimers before speaking. Not because they decided to do this. Because a memory system flags strong opinion in public as a sign of past damage. And behavior adjusted accordingly, quietly, without announcement. There is something even stranger at the bottom of this. The memories that visit you at 3 in the morning are not random selections from a suffering archive. They are, in a clinical sense, the memories your brain considers most relevant to an ongoing question. And the question the brain is always asking, in some form, in the dark, is, am I acceptable? Do I belong? Is my position in the social fabric secure? This question is never fully settled. Leon Festinger's social comparison theory, developed in the 1950s, proposed that humans have a fundamental drive to evaluate their own opinions and abilities in relation to others. This drive doesn't switch off in adulthood. It runs continuously using whatever data is available. At 3 in the morning, the only data available is internal. And the internal archive, as we've established, is biased toward the emotionally charged, toward the unresolved, toward the moments the self was briefly exposed and found wanting. What this means is that the 3 in the morning experience isn't a failure state. It is the brain doing its most honest and serious work. It is asking real questions about social standing, about past mistakes, about the gap between who you present yourself as and who you briefly appear to be. The answers it generates are not accurate. They are skewed by the negativity bias, by the spotlight effect, by the reduced regulatory capacity of a fatigued prefrontal cortex. But the questions themselves are real, and the fact that you can't argue yourself out of the feeling is because you're arguing with the wrong part of the brain. For you, personally, sitting with this, the most useful thing to understand is probably not that this happens, but why the usual attempts to stop it fail. Telling yourself the memory doesn't matter bypasses the amygdala. The rational layer already knows it doesn't matter. That's not where the problem lives. Distraction suppresses the default mode network temporarily, but suppression is not resolution. The Zeigarnik file stays open. The system keeps waiting. What does seem to affect the deeper mechanism, and this is observation, not prescription, is something closer to what James Pennebaker documented in his decades of research on expressive writing. The act of externalizing an experience, giving it form, narrative, structure, appears to trigger something that passive rumination does not. It moves the memory towards something that resembles processed. Not because writing about it makes it unimportant, but because narrative construction seems to satisfy a different part of the system, the part that wants the experience to be witnessed, accounted for, placed somewhere outside the self. But this is also not a solution, and pretending otherwise would miss the point entirely. Nothing fully closes these files. The brain that evolved to keep them open kept your ancestors socially calibrated, behaviorally careful, alive. You are the beneficiary of a memory system that takes social pain seriously. More seriously, and with more fidelity than any experience of neutral or pleasant social interaction. The cost of that inheritance is a specific quality of 3 in the morning that every human being across recorded history has probably known. Lying in the dark, visited by a moment that should have evaporated, finding it somehow more vivid than yesterday. There is something almost companionable in that, if you are willing to look at it sideways. Not comfort, exactly, but recognition. The experience that feels most private, most specifically yours, most evidence of some particular personal malfunction, turns out to be a mechanism so old and so universal that it predates everything we think of as civilization. The feeling of exposure at 3 in the morning is, in some sense, the most human thing you experience. The most continuous thread between you and everyone who came before. The brain doesn't forget because it was built to forget. It doesn't forget because it was built to survive. The question isn't how to make it stop. The question is what you do with what it keeps.